Greetings, everyone. This is Virtuous Roots, where we reclaim virtue to bring it to our home and yours. And I'm Thomas McCuddy.
I'm Thomas Quackenbush.
I'm Nick Wiegand. And today's topic is on this idea of leisure and education. This is something that growing up, I never knew about, thought of, anything. And so I credit Thomas here for kind of even bringing this into my life and just even the idea of this.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna let you open it. Explain the correlation between leisure and education, the classical view of it versus the cultural view of both of these now, and just kind of like bring it all together for those that are listening and kind of, how it came about for us.
So, I mean, there's been whole like large books written on this. The really short, 1 minute version. The whole idea of school comes from a Greek word skole, which means leisure. So the whole idea is that if you're going to learn, it needs to be from a place of leisure. Like you can't be essentially working in the fields all day and be doing all this work and be learning. So I think what's happened in the modern world is we take this idea of academia and rigor, and it becomes almost like this job and strenuous and factory and formal. So the classical idea is that you learn from, and actually one of the books that influenced my wife was like, I think it's called like Learning from Rest. And the whole idea is like in our regular lives, learning should be a natural part. It should be fun. It should be part of what we do. And we like to, in the modern world, we compartmentalize. We have our school time, we have
Yeah.
our learning time, and it's almost like we work towards graduating so we can throw off the shackles of school. And even in church, I remember I struggled. Some adults would get upset. They would feel like things are being too academic. There's too much learning, as if that's almost not
Right.
holy, or I'm doing something wrong. And I'm like, but there's this sense learning shouldn't be so compartmentalized and so separate. So this idea of leisure is like as we're doing life, as we are even in our recreation. And I'll give the example that happened very recently with my 8-year-old. So we have these little audiobook machines called Yotos, and we have these cards and everything from like Wizard of Oz to Mozart. I mean, it's just really cool. And he got some new ones, and I didn't know what he had. So I was like, hey, let's sit down and listen together. And he chooses one, and he chooses this thing that lasts like an hour, and it was all this big long story about birds, like different raptors and owls, and he has this little raven friend, and they're doing all this weird stuff. But it's learning all about their habitats, their life cycles, even which ones are on the endangered list, all that. So for over an hour, we're listening to the story, but we're doing it as fun. This is our leisure time. Like we're just hanging out. But I learned a lot about birds. I learned about the owls, and they went through the whole like how owls make pellets and all that. Like it was all part of the story. And again, my child's learning, and we get done, and we had the equivalent. And I remember in school having these lessons. I remember when we actually went to preserve and we learned about owl pellets and all that, and it was again all formal. We just did that in playtime, and my son has learned. And so I think we get so wrapped up in school is this thing over there. And even one thing we've pushed back in the homeschool community is I think sometimes we try to make the home like a school instead of just
Just
learning
this
in the home.
natural, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But I think what also spawns some of this is our formalized accreditation style education that you've got to meet these objectives and you have to do it this way, and and it's all this objective driven learning
Yeah.
and verifying that you've learned. That's what happens in the school. And that if you can't quantify it, if you can't put it on a rubric, then it's learning hasn't happened. And that's what I push back on. That's the whole idea of this leisure in education. You can actually learn even though you haven't done an essay that you've been graded on.
Yeah.
And that's where it changes, because I've been exploring this idea of even education, not just from the home, but in the church. We separate these things. And I think that what if even in our church world, church education, we learned how to have leisure and it becomes part of our lifestyle.
Yeah.
in the church.
And I think that's the major issue, is that we associate like education with like, you know, academia or going to college or getting a degree or the next degree or whatever.
And standardized testing becomes such a big part of that.
Because it just, I'm like, that doesn't, it just doesn't really evaluate the person. It just validates some, like, you're able to spew out information and regurgitate it on a test. We're talking about as knowledge, as a habit, as something that you love to do, and it becomes part and parcel of who you are. And I know when I teach the Bible, and because I love learning theology and philosophy and scripture, like it's such a pleasurable experience for me to sit down and do a Bible study for a class as I'm about to teach it. And if I do it right, and I put the amount of work that I need and the effort I need into learning it, and just kind of like, because a lot of as any Bible teacher would tell you, or any pastor, well, they should, is that passage has to work on their heart before you can bring it before a congregation. It has to work on them, and you have to actually wrestle with these ideas before you're even going to give it to your congregation or your class or whatever. And I know when I'm able to do that well is when I'm able to speak freely. It's not coming from like a piece of paper. I might have my notes there just to keep me in line, but if I'm able to speak intelligently and clearly on a subject, I know that I have embodied that idea, and that it's not just me just giving them information. I'm using examples. I'm thinking how this relates to my life and how it could relate to their lives. I could all of this stuff comes to play. I'm able to tell stories, like all the different tools that I have, that I can convey this idea to them. But it's not just, it's something that you become. And I think that leisure idea of sitting down, not just like vegging out. And I think that's, Thomas began to allude to that. It's not us coming home and having leisure time. That means that we're going to sit and watch television or do those such things where our mind gets shut off. But leisure time being quiet time where you're able to think clearly, contemplate things, and learn. And I think that's really important for us. And because we don't do that, we tend to just it's get a degree and you're a master of that domain. Do this and you're a master. Like, but most people, like, how much do you remember? If you think back to your high school experience, how many things do you actually remember? Or do you remember those teachers, those ones that poured their lives into their students? And that's what I take away.
I'm going to be honest. I don't remember any of that. I don't, I didn't have the teachers who poured their life. I mean, I'm sure I did.
Yeah.
But I don't remember that at all. Like, I didn't grow up with this idea of leisure and education. I think, I don't know if I've shared this, but I went to a gifted school and I hated school with a passion.
Yep.
I literally was handed this like incredible opportunity for education to explore these things. And I hated school.
Yep.
Like, I hated it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, when my kids were little, so my youngest was born in 2004. We would go on nature walks and they would ask questions and we would just talk about nature, and I love nature. And so I think I implemented this a little bit in my kids' lives, but until 2016, which is when I met you. So we've known each other about 10 years now. 2016 was the first time, that's when I went to Bible college. And I started learning about something I wanted to learn about.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to engage in conversations with you and other professors who were passionate.
Sure, they're passionate.
And then I remember getting invited to a book club. I think it was at your house.
Mm-hmm.
And like growing up, I always heard about book clubs being like, oh, we're going to get together and read this stupid fictional story and talk about it. And it was always, no. Like it was a philosophy book club and we were reading these
methodical
crazy
realism.
Okay, you had to bring that one up. Like, it was literally the worst book I've ever read. Other than that one book, like, we got into these just incredible conversations. We got to sit around, and it was leisure, but it was literally engaging in thought and conversation and debate, and it's life-changing.
Yeah, it is.
And then I got to bring that into my kids' lives.
Mm-hmm.
And my daughters, like, it was a game that they would come in on Saturday nights when I was finishing up a sermon, and they would try to, like, keep me up as late as they could. Like, so my daughter would sit with me till like 2:00 in the morning on Saturday nights in my office, engaging in questions and conversations about scripture, about all kinds of things. But
Mhm.
and then I took it to another level. She ended up in college, and I'm like, so what are you working on? And she's like, oh, we're reading this book, and it's great. And so I would get the book, and I'd read it at the same time so that we could engage in these conversations, and so I could like
Mhm.
flip it back around and start, following her. When you actually can embrace the idea of education and leisure, I mean, it's life changing.
It is.
It's life changing for your kids. It's life changing for you as an individual because no one, and I hated school. I literally joined the army because of how much I hated school. I could not stand the thought of sitting through another class. And I thought I would never sit in another class for the rest of my life. Lo and behold, I went to the army. You have to sit in class. But like, I hated school. And then I embraced this idea and I love it. I want to keep going to school, but it's only if I can find schools where I can engage like that.
Yep.
Mhm. And I think that notion, why, and again, I work at a Bible college, so I mean, I'm not anti-institution, but I think institution serves a role. But I think we've dumped all that is education on the institution, such that we think that if we don't have a syllabus and we don't have our objectives and we don't have our testing, that education has not happened. And that's the idea I push back against. And that's why, especially in the home, when you have, again, if you're a family and you've got kids in the public school and they're coming home, there is this sense, this is the families I'm really looking towards. Like, it's not that, well, they've done education and now I'm just responsible for what? Basic needs and play.
Mm-hmm.
There's this element of creating lifelong learners and creating the kind of people who love to learn. And that's not something you really turn off.
Right.
And so you turn off what you don't like. I put in my time, I'm done, and I don't want to look at it again. Versus I sometimes, as I'm working on stuff and I'm doing things in my free time, and I'll share, hey, here's what I did in my free time, or here's what I was reading, and people are like, you do that in your free time?
Yeah.
And like, yeah.
I remember thinking that at some point about you, and
Yeah.
then and yeah,
Because I love it. I mean, that was the whole idea, is that there is that phrase people say, find what you love and you'll never work another day in your life. Well, again, if you love learning, you never encounter really the arduousness or the unpleasantness that comes with having to study.
Yeah.
You're really cultivating the virtue of studiousness, where you love to learn what is true. Your mind desires it. Studiousness is a virtue of temperance. So temperance is what regulates our sense of pleasure. So I think for most people, they lack that studiousness. They lack that desire to know truth. That truth is good to know. Like when I was learning about birds, this is what I think people also do too. They're like, I learned about birds this weekend. And they're like, well, when are you going to use that? That becomes, that is your Western pragmatic, well, when are you ever going to use that? Or it translates to, how is that going to make you money in the real world?
right.
I mean, it doesn't, but I just learned about my world. I learned about these creatures, and there is a sense, part of the whole reason they put this card together was to bring awareness to certain birds that are on the red list.
Right.
And now there's this element, and talks about, here's how you can do, it was talking about the effects of like certain pesticides and things that happen to like the bird populations. Well, that is practical knowledge. That is good to know. And I think, again, we just try to attach sometimes a cash value. And I had students when I was a youth pastor, and they were like, had a unit they were doing on Shakespeare. Like, and again, when am I ever going to use Shakespeare in my life? When am I ever going to use this? It's the wrong question. It's with Shakespeare, you're joining in and you're reading the things that people have read for hundreds of years that have impacted millions upon millions of people.
Right.
Yeah.
And not to mention just the intellectual virtue you're going to gain by having to try to read Shakespeare. Because, again, number one, he doesn't talk like us. And number two, he actually writes really well. Like there's some there's some deep things.
He
and
tells
connections.
Stories well, yeah.
And
fantastic.
And so that's one aspect. And the moment we fall into that trap of, well, I'm never going to use this, so it's useless or it's stupid, it should just simply be, again, I have only so much life to live, and in my leisure time, if I'm constantly learning and growing, I don't have to go to a college and take a course on birds.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm gonna throw this verse in here right now because it fits with what you're saying. It's
Mhm.
Proverbs 1:5-6. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. And so this idea is that biblically, like the Proverbs tell us that it is wise to learn and to continue to, like, this idea of being a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and I thought about Thomas too. Like we talk about the birds. Like now, when you go on a hike, so if you bring your kids, and we always bring up how to become better parents. How cool is it to be able to go into the woods with your kids and be able to point to these birds and be like, that's that kind of bird, and just
Mhm.
knowing what it is,
Mhm.
and not just going into where everything's just a mystery. Because it's cool because like my father-in-law and I, we built a relationship before he passed away where we would go hiking, and there was certain plants that we would be like, I wonder what this is. So we'd, back then we didn't have the apps and everything where you can just take a picture of it. So we would take the attributes, take a picture of it, and then we'd compare it online when we got back. And it was really cool. So every time we went out, we knew what we're doing, and we kind of we got oriented a little bit, and it actually enriched the whole experience for us. Because now we're not just like these people that are just going through this mysterious environment and just, going to the other end. We're actually interacting with it. And I like the idea of birds because it's just so cool, because all of a sudden they appear and you're like, I know what that is. And that's a rare bird, or that's this, or even as somebody that if you go into like, that's an invasive species, like that shouldn't be there. That's causing this harm. Or looking at trees with some, like you were able to kind of really understand why, instead of just like, just learning information for information's sake.
And we've never talked about birds, the three of us, ever before this moment.
yet.
But I'm going to chime in here. You said, people are going to say, when have you ever used that? Like 12 to 15 years ago, somewhere around there, I saw a falconry demonstration and decided I was going to be a falconer. And I read everything there was to read about falconry and bird falcons and all of the different raptors and all of these things. And I've had so many conversations about raptors and
It's so
falcons
cool.
over the last 15 years just because somebody brought it up. And I'm like, oh, did you know blah, 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 blah. Now, I never got a falcon because if you're curious, look into the process. You have to, be in it for like 2 years before you can actually obtain the license for yourself to have it. I was like, I'm not that dedicated. But now I know more about birds, and I learned enough to know that it wasn't for me. But there's an element there. I did it just for the fun of it, and it has enriched my conversation. And I've known that with more than just falcons. Like anytime anything ever like interests me, I dive in to learn, and then I can have a conversation with almost anybody at this point in my life because I've dabbled in so many different things. I have some sort of shared interest along the way for some reason.
And I think that's great for especially the Great Commission. Like all of this stuff is everything. That's why it's God's creation, his revelation to us. And he gave it to us so that we can like basically, as we're trying to explain the gospel to people, we have like ample amount of information that surrounds us, that we can use that as bridges and conversation starters, and like it's just good. And I think that, how many times I've used like just a common experience between me and somebody else that I've just met to talk about Jesus, and I'm like, it just worked really well into this situation.
Right.
And in the process of learning, as you're doing this in a community. Like you're doing this. We're talking about us particularly with our children,
Mm-hmm.
because I think in school, the dreaded thing was the group project.
Mm.
That's what you did not want to
No.
do, because that was the bane of your existence. Because again, it's just a bad social experiment. And so this is what happens. We get trained that way, where just let me do my workbook, let me do my page, let me write my thing, let me do it and be done. And instead of you're getting the enjoyment of learning about God's creation, that God is the one who designed all these things, all these animals, all like as you look to the stars. We got one of the kids in our co-op. He started going into this long expose on why you can't actually stand on Saturn, and like some people think it's a gas giant, and that was a misnomer. And he's like, what, 6?
Yeah,
7?
he's educated me about all the black holes. And
Yeah, like this
Yeah.
kid has deep dived in astronomy.
No, he's older than 6.
And
He's like 8.
okay, so he's He's
It's
he's
not that much older.
Yeah.
But I'd say he's 8.
but it's one of those where I look at this, he has a passion, and again, looking to the stars and understanding. Actually, astronomy was one of the 7 classic liberal arts
Mm.
that you had your trivium, which was like your grammar, your logic, and your dialectic. But then you had the quadrivium, the 4, and it was astronomy was the thing that would teach you motion. And then you had like your geometry, and you got to learn about with the shapes, and you had it was music, because you're also learning about the patterns. And so this is again why when we're doing the education, we're learning things, and like even when it comes to music, you're learning more than just how to hit keys in a certain order. You're learning about rhythms and patterns and math and all of these components.
Yeah.
So that's why, even if we're going back to birds, you're learning about environment, you're learning about history, you're learning about even, it was completely unrelated, but the next day at church, my oldest brings up about homing pigeons for some reason,
Mm.
and we're discussing the nature of homing
It's
pigeons.
definitely an interesting
And
topic.
who is the first person to figure out that you could do that with birds? Like, who is the first person who sat around and thought, you know what, I can teach this bird how to, like, hone into a certain place, and like
I
his
think-
spouse looked at him and like, you're crazy. So now we want to deep dive. We want to actually
I
figure
think it
this
was
out.
Noah, maybe Noah with the ark.
Noah. Oh yeah.
That
So
might have been it.
I
that
think
might have
that's a
been the
good
first
call.
place where you
I
get
think that's a
that.
good call.
I think it's the first
Well,
instance of that.
so I think kind of what I want to make sure we don't leave without re-emphasizing is the difference between this idea of leisure and education and a formal education.
Right.
If we look at our formal education as this thing that we must do, have to do, because you won't be anything if you don't go to college, is what I was
Credentials.
told. Credentials. If you're
Mhm.
doing it for the credentialing, it's a waste of time. Charlie Kirk, one of the things, like, he wrote a book, College is a Scam. And he doesn't mean that all college is bad, but what he is really kind of keying in on is this idea of learning for the sake of learning. And he would have these debates and all of these conversations with college educated individuals and students, but it's all based on knowledge that he learned through leisure and just his own
Mhm.
pursuit. And so it's interesting when he talks about this idea that, this concept of college being a scam. It's an interesting idea that I think that if you take away from what his intention is, that we all ought to be lifelong learners, and we all ought to just really treat our education as a leisure time.
Mhm.
And if we do it, we can pass it on to our children, on to
Absolutely.
our families,
Mhm.
and it is absolutely life changing.
And my
Mhm.
daughter now carries a book with her when she goes, like, the doctor's appointments and stuff, because she always sees me. I don't think I go anywhere without a book. Like, just anytime I have where I can just sit. I mean, I know I have conversations with folks, but when I have those moments, I usually have something there always, just because I get a moment, 5 minutes here to read a page or two, think about it, and I don't know. Like, so it kind of gets passed on.
Okay. Yeah.
It becomes a habit, like we're talking about. And again, do you love
Yeah.
knowledge? You love truth, is what it boils down to. And I think it's worth in our few moments left, because one of the vices, obviously with studiousness, would be the lack thereof. But there is a vice of excess.
Yeah.
And Aquinas the word he attached to it was curiosity. And so we'll call it like a vicious curiosity, one where you are pursuing knowledge that is not worthwhile. And I would say this is where things like doom scrolling and like some of the ideas that are not of God's creation,
Mhm.
that you just start deep diving into, that do not in any way reach to what is true.
Yeah.
And again, when we start doing those kinds of things, or like if you spend all your time in the tabloids and finding out what's going
Yeah.
on with the stars, that's the kind of thing where having a little bit of knowledge of events is good, but that's where you would recognize this is not leading to the goodness and the beauty that should be following that truth.
So I want to leave with a practical challenge for the parents. A good way to start this is, if your child asks a question, explore the answer with them and learn it together.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not something you may be the most interested in, still explore it together, learn
Yeah.
it together, and expand on it. And then the next question, and then the next question. I think it's just a practical way that we as parents, and
It-
that maybe we can begin this journey.
We don't have to rely on experts to take us on this journey. We can do it ourselves.
Right.
Mhm.
So, gentlemen, thanks for the conversation. You can find us at familiesofvirtue.com and our podcast, Virtuous Roots, on all major streaming platforms. Be blessed, and we'll talk to you next time.